The battle began without warning, already in motion, already dying. Void shields flared and failed as Imperial warships tore past one another at suicidal range. Macro cannons firing until barrels glowed white and ruptured. Boarding torpedoes punched through adamantium hulls, spilling Astartes into corridors filled with fire and decompression screams. Vox channels collapsed into static and half-spoken prayers. No rallying cries followed, no clear command voice. Only overlapping orders, shouted and rescinded in the same breath, as if the Imperium itself had forgotten why these forces were here. On the surface below, the world burned in disciplined silence. Titans advanced through ash storms, their god engines trading plasma fire that split continents and boiled seas into poisonous clouds. Regiments of Imperial infantry charged through shell-torn cities, banners aflame, lost guns firing into shapes obscured by smoke and interference. Something corrupted the Auspex readings. Targeting spirits refused identification. Kill confirmations contradicted visual evidence. Soldiers watched enemies fall, then rise again as something else, forcing bayonets and armor they recognized into heraldry that mirrored their own. Confusion became terror when the orders changed. Loyal formations were suddenly marked hostile. Fire arcs realigned without explanation. Thunderhawks were torn from the sky by defensive batteries bearing Imperial sigils. Astartes kill teams breached command bunkers to find them already purged. Officers executed by bolt rounds bearing Legion markings that matched the attackers. No declaration of treachery followed. No explanation came. Only the cold efficiency of extermination protocols unfolding without context, as if obedience itself had become a weapon turned inward. Astropathic choirs screamed as messages fractured mid-thought. Names dissolved into redacted static. Entire battle groups vanished from fleet registries in real time. Time itself seemed unstable. Veterans swore hours repeated. Engagements restarting with different outcomes. Memories slipping between heartbeats. Chaplains found their litanies failing. Words losing meaning on their tongues. Even the Emperor's name carried no certainty here. Faith did not strengthen resolve. It exposed a widening crack, a sense that this battle violated something foundational, something the Imperium could not afford to acknowledge. The end came without victory or retreat. A single transmission cut through every channel, calm and absolute, issued from an authority beyond appeal. All forces were ordered to enact final sanction. No survivors. No relics. No memory. Cyclonic warheads fell, void detonations consumed fleets, and the world was reduced to drifting cinders. As the last signal faded, an official record overwrote the silence, declaring the system empty, the campaign non-existent. The battle died twice, once in fire and once in history. The war had begun long before the first shot was fired, concealed beneath layers of classification and denial. The anomaly surfaced as a logistical impossibility, a sector that consumed resources without ever appearing in official tallies. Fleets were rerouted, regiments reassigned, and Titan legions placed on standby for a campaign that possessed no name. Star charts disagreed with themselves. Astropathic routes curved into empty coordinates, then returned with confirmation pings from places that should not exist. The administratum flagged the discrepancy, then buried it beneath emergency seals. What could not be explained was reframed as necessity, and necessity, within the Imperium, required no justification beyond obedience. Orders followed, precise and sterile, stripped of rhetoric. A combined Imperial force was assembled with unusual speed, drawing elements from distant crusades and unfinished wars. No public declaration was made. No victory condition was stated. Commanders received sealed briefings that could only be opened once en route, and even then, entire sections were redacted in black sigils of authority higher than any present. The lack of context unsettled even veteran officers. Wars were meant to have enemies, objectives, and an end state. This campaign offered none. Only a destination that did not appear on any sanction map, and a repeated directive that silence was as vital as success. As the fleets translated into the void, inconsistencies multiplied. Vox logs referenced battles that had not yet occurred. Casualty reports listed the names of soldiers still standing on the bridge. Navigators dreamed of the same burning world, though none could describe it upon waking. Chaplains reported a subtle erosion of faith among the ranks, not rebellion, but unease, an instinctive sense that the Emperor's light dimmed in a direction no one could identify. Attempts to raise concerns were acknowledged, logged, and quietly removed from ship records, as if the act of questioning itself threatened operational integrity. Planetfall confirmed what command would not articulate. The world bore the scars of previous wars that official history denied. Ruined fortresses lay half-buried beneath ash, their architectural styles spanning millennia that could not logically coexist. Wreckage of Imperial armor littered the surface, bearing regimental markings long declared extinct. Servitors uncovered data slates whose timestamps contradicted one another by centuries. This was not a first contact, nor even a rediscovered battlefield. It was a place repeatedly fought over, repeatedly erased, and yet never fully destroyed. The implications settled heavily among the officers. The Imperium had been here before and had chosen to forget. Still, the war advanced, driven by doctrine older than doubt. Recon units vanished beyond Auspex range. Defensive lines were established against an enemy that refused identification. Fire plans were executed flawlessly against targets that did not behave as targets should. With every hour, the truth became harder to ignore. This was not a war of conquest or survival. It was containment. Something on this world threatened the Imperium not by force, but by revelation. Victory was irrelevant. The only acceptable outcome was suppression, and the commanders understood, with growing horror, that they had not been sent to win a battle, but to ensure it could never be remembered. The truth did not arrive as revelation but as erosion, a steady collapse of certainty under sustained contact. Imperial forces advanced expecting resistance, yet what they encountered was recognition. Defensive emplacements reacted before targeting protocols engaged, tracking friendly signatures with unsettling precision. Vox intercepts echoed Imperial command syntax, distorted but intact, as if spoken by a mouth that had learned the language too well. Data recovered from ruined strongholds contained strategic doctrines predating their official publication. This was not imitation. It was inheritance. The battlefield responded like a scar reopening, remembering wounds inflicted across forgotten centuries. Every engagement stripped away another layer of denial, forcing commanders to confront an impossible conclusion. The enemy knew the Imperium because it had once been part of it. As casualties mounted, the shape of the war clarified in fragments no briefing had prepared them for. Prisoners were taken briefly, only to dissolve under interrogation, bodies unraveling into ash and light as if reality rejected their continued existence. Others spoke willingly, voices calm, words precise, describing a humanity that had once pursued truth rather than obedience. They spoke an imperial ideal abandoned, of an emperor misunderstood not as a god, but as a warden. These accounts were dismissed officially, yet they spread through the ranks with viral inevitability. Soldiers hesitated. Astartes questioned kill orders, not out of mercy, but because the act of killing felt like self-mutilation, as if each shot erased something within the shooter as much as the target. The fracture widened when relics were uncovered beneath the primary fortress complex. Not Xeno's artifacts, nor warp-tainted icons, but Imperial technology bearing sigils deliberately struck from record. Gene-coded vaults open to those who should not have been authorized, revealing evidence of sanctioned divergence. Human enclaves permitted to evolve outside Imperial control. These enclaves had not fallen to chaos. They had not rebelled. They had simply refused stagnation. The Imperium's response long ago had been extermination disguised as crusade. The enemy on this world were the remnants of that choice, preserved by isolation and repetition, living proof that alternatives had once existed. The danger they posed was not military. It was philosophical. Command cohesion collapsed under the weight of that knowledge. Some officers attempted withdrawal, citing strategic futility and unacceptable informational contamination. Others demanded immediate escalation, orbital bombardment to cleanse the surface before further exposure. Orders contradicted one another within minutes, all bearing legitimate authority seals. The chain of command became a circle, looping endlessly back upon itself. In the confusion, entire battalions ceased fighting altogether, choosing containment over aggression, erecting cordons to prevent the spread of what they had learned. These units were immediately designated compromised. Loyalist forces received new targeting parameters, and the battlefield shifted from contested ground to controlled purge. The final realization came too late to alter its consequence. The Imperium had not stumbled into a forbidden war. It had returned to one deliberately unfinished. Each iteration had refined the process, narrowing the margins through which truth could escape. This time, however, too many had seen. Too many had understood. The enemy had not needed to defeat the Imperium. It had only needed to endure long enough to be witnessed. When the final sanction was issued, it was not an act of desperation but of routine. Extermination protocols activated across all theaters, indiscriminate and absolute. Loyal and compromise were erased together, because distinction no longer mattered. The truth had surfaced, and the Imperium responded as it always did when confronted with its own reflection, by destroying the mirror. The purge began with numbers, not fire, before cyclonic torpedoes were armed, before titans were silenced and fleets consigned to annihilation. The Imperium recalculated reality itself. Tides were adjusted retroactively. Crusade records were amended to show uninterrupted progression. Entire regiments were reassigned on parchment alone, their service transferred to other wars they had never fought. Administratum adepts worked in sealed vaults, rewriting ledgers that defined existence. A soldier without a record had never lived. A battle without a record had never occurred. This was the Imperium's first weapon, wielded with absolute precision. Even as men still bled on the surface below, their names were already being removed from history, erased not as punishment, but as precaution. The second phase was biological. Survivors marked for extraction were not rescued, but quarantined. Medicae ships became processing chambers where memory itself was treated as contamination. Astropaths were the first to be destroyed, their minds flayed clean to prevent the truth from echoing through the warp. Navigators were blinded, then executed. Astartes who had breached the inner vaults were subjected to genetic purges, their progenoid glands destroyed to ensure no trace of altered understanding could persist. Chaplains were silenced mid-sermon, not for heresy, but for having heard too much. Loyalty was no defense. Obedience was irrelevant. Knowledge alone was a crime, and the sentence was absolute removal. On the surface, the extermination unfolded with methodical cruelty. Orbital strikes were timed to eliminate population centers first, not for tactical advantage, but to collapse narrative continuity. Cities that had existed across multiple forgotten iterations were reduced to glass, their ruins erased so thoroughly that even Archaeotech would find nothing to question. Titans were destroyed by their own escorts, God engines sacrificed to ensure no machine spirits survived with corrupted memories. Entire companies were ordered into kill zones already marked for bombardment, their final duty to vanish without witnesses. The enemy was not pursued. It was enveloped, drowned beneath annihilation so complete that nothing recognizable remained to testify. Victory was not declared. Silence was enforced. The final stage extended beyond the battlefield, stretching across centuries. Inquisitorial cells were dispatched to worlds whose only crime was curiosity. Scholars disappeared for asking why certain campaigns skipped numbers. Archivists were executed for noticing gaps. Relics recovered from unrelated wars were quietly destroyed if their provenance traced too close to the forbidden system. Even myths were edited. Stories that echoed too closely were recast as allegory or condemned as chaos corruption. The Imperium did not simply erase a battle. It cultivated ignorance as doctrine. By the time the last trace faded, even the act of erasure had been forgotten. What remained was stability, purchased at the cost of truth. The Imperium endured, intact and unquestioning, because it had learned once again that survival did not depend on righteousness or victory, but on the ruthless management of memory itself. Centuries passed, and the Imperium settled into the comfort of its own continuity. The stars burned as they always had. Wars followed wars, and the machinery of survival ground forward without pause. Yet the absence left by the buried battle never truly closed. It lingered as an invisible pressure, a distortion in the fabric of imperial thought. Entire sectors developed traditions of silence without knowing why. Certain questions instinctively went unasked. Navigators avoided specific warp currents, not due to recorded hazard, but because ancient unease clung to those routes like residue. The Imperium called this wisdom, never realizing it was inherited fear, passed down without context from a crime no one remembered committing. Fragments survived despite every precaution. A corrupted data slate surfaced briefly on a forged world, its contents dismissed as scrap code before being destroyed, yet not before a tech priest noted unfamiliar design logic embedded within. A shrine world recorded a recurring vision among its penitents, a nameless battlefield, imperial banners burning beneath imperial fire. Inquisitors traced these anomalies with ruthless efficiency, but even their reports showed signs of decay, entire sections sealed or excised before reaching Terra. The truth no longer needed to exist in full, to be dangerous. Even echoes threatened stability. The Imperium responded as it always did, tightening its grip, mistaking repression for strength. Unaware that each act of suppression confirmed the fragility it refused to confront. The greatest consequence, however, was not hidden in records or ruins, but in belief itself. The Imperium taught that humanity endured because it was chosen, protected by divine will and eternal purpose. The buried battle contradicted this at its core. It proved that survival was not sacred, only managed, that obedience mattered more than justice. That truth was expendable when it endangered cohesion. Over time, this unspoken doctrine shaped every decision. Crusade became purges. Faith became compliance. Hope narrowed into endurance alone. The Imperium did not stagnate by accident. It was trained to fear change, because once long ago, change had nearly exposed what it truly was. The lost battle was not an anomaly. It was a warning the Imperium refused to remember. In the end, nothing marked the grave of what had been erased. No monument stood. No forbidden date appeared on any calendar. Yet the Imperium's greatest strength and greatest weakness were born from that silence. It survived 10,000 years not because it was righteous, but because it learned how to forget. Every world that burned, every regiment sacrificed without record, every truth rewritten into acceptable myth followed the same pattern first perfected there. The lost battle lived on in method, not memory. And as the Imperium marched endlessly toward an uncertain future, it carried within itself the seed of that ancient crime, repeating it whenever necessary, because it could not survive any other way. The Imperium never spoke of closure, because closure implies an ending, and endings invite reflection. Instead, it allowed the echo to fade naturally, trusting time to finish what fire and silence had begun. Generations lived and died beneath banners that promised eternal vigilance, unaware that vigilance had once failed and been punished with erasure. Children learned catechisms that omitted entire philosophies. Officers memorized doctrines refined not for victory, but for containment. The stars themselves seemed compliant, burning steadily as if nothing had ever been wrong. And yet, beneath this apparent order, the Imperium carried a structural wound. It did not bleed. It did not fester. It simply hardened, becoming part of the framework that held everything together, unseen but essential. Occasionally, at the edge of sanctioned knowledge, something would stir. A commander would hesitate before issuing an extermination order, feeling a pressure he could not name. A historian would pause over an empty reference index, sensing significance in the absence itself. A dying soldier would dream of fighting comrades whose faces felt familiar in a way training could not explain. These moments never aligned, never formed a coherent threat. They were isolated, unprovable, easily dismissed. The Imperium relied on this fragmentation. Truth scattered loses its power. Meaning divided becomes noise. What could not be fully erased was diluted until it no longer mattered. Until even those who sense a void within the narrative learned to ignore it for the sake of survival. The greatest irony was that the Imperium believed this forgetting to be strength. It praised resilience while mistaking numbness for endurance. It called stagnation stability and obedience virtue. The buried battle had taught a single, unforgiving lesson, that humanity could not be trusted with its own potential. From that lesson flowed 10,000 years of policy, sacrifice, and sanctioned cruelty. Worlds burned not because they rebelled, but because they might remember. Innovation was strangled not because it failed, but because it risked deviation. The Imperium did not fear chaos most of all. It feared clarity. It feared the moment when humanity might look upon itself without myth and decide it deserved something more than endless war. And so the Imperium endured, vast and brutal and unchallenged, marching forward on foundations reinforced by omission. The lost battle remained lost not because it was insignificant, but because it was too significant to survive. It had revealed that the Imperium was not inevitable, not divine, not even necessary, only persistent. That knowledge was more dangerous than any enemy fleet or warp-born god. To remember would be to invite choice, and choice was the one thing the Imperium could never allow. In the grim darkness of the far future, there would be only war, not because it was unavoidable, but because forgetting had made it so.